So one of the things I've been doing with this time off is I went and looked at Simulated Ape. Now, Simulated Ape can be run from the command line, and you get basically the full command line environment plus also the GUI environment if you run the command line from the GUI at the entry point, basically. Now, this is a technique that very few people, I think, have ever used, and I use it specifically because it's a really cool way of actually accessing the simulation in both degrees. Now, let's cast our mind back June 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, and I was I was enabling London 1940 to reach the same code. So I rewrote the command line environment to be generic and to accept basically many different command line interfaces, including the London 1940 command line interface. And at that point, I introduced a bug. Now, how do you go back after 6 months and actually find this bug and work out what was going on? Well, that took about 6 hours. It took about 4 hours, actually, spread out over 6 hours yesterday. Actually, probably close to spread out over 10 hours because I came back to it periodically and had a look at it. Now, I understand by you listening to this podcast, you are in a very specialized group because this podcast has an audience which has been interesting over the past year in terms of the fact that, you know, there are people that are clearly very interested in the stuff that I'm doing, but they don't actively participate. So there's a kind of happy medium of people that are interested in the stuff that I'm doing and are willing to passively review podcast recordings about the stuff that I'm doing. So in parallel to working on the Ape SDK Simulated Ape here specifically, I've also been wondering what this audience is really about. So if you're a listener to this podcast and I don't know who you are, or even if you're a listener to this podcast and I do know who you are, please get in contact with me and just give me some discussion to who you are and why you're listening to this podcast. I know you're out there because Apple's podcast algorithm tells me how many listeners I have to each recording that I put out. But it strikes me as very curious that this number is slightly larger than I would have originally imagined, and I'm interested in recording more content that is specifically aimed at existing listeners to this podcast, if that makes sense. So in my day-to-day, a bunch of stuff comes up periodically, and I would like to know specifically if long funk recording makes sense about these things, hence by starting the recording talking about the Ape SDK and Simulated Ape. I'm really not clear how many people actively use this, but I think it's a relatively small and gentrified number. Gentrified, is that the right term? I'm not sure what the correct term would be here, but a relatively small number of people who are interested in using this simulation. And maybe this podcast has absolutely no overlap with those people. Or maybe this podcast just represents people that are glad that I'm doing the work that I'm doing. The Ape SDK ongoing I've run it from different places, and I've also publicly once talked about rewriting the original simulation in Swift, which is a project that I'm also doing in the winter time off. Welcome to being born in the southern hemisphere and living for most of your life in the northern hemisphere. The end of year always still feels like summer in some regard. It has been a remarkably mild winter at Las Vegas. We've had, if you speak this language, temperatures in the 50s, come to the early 60s, which means if you're going on a long walk, you don't really need that jacket, thank you very much. In fact, the jacket becomes a burden after a period of time. So, I'm saying Happy New Year, and, well, Christmas is over, but Happy New Year to those that are listening to this podcast, and please get in contact with me. My email address, Bravo Alpha Romeo, Bravo Alpha Lima Echo Tango @gmail.com. I'm really interested in getting a sense of who the listeners are and also the eclectic listeners that I wouldn't expect to listen. If that is you, please get in contact just to say hi and just to say this is the stuff that interests me through these long funk recordings, because quite frankly, I put out stuff and think about it, and sometimes I think that's not really the audience of long funk, and I go through a few of these iterations before I actually put the audio out. So a short podcast, wishing you a happy new year and asking for any feedback if you have any. Tom Barbalet in Las Vegas, Nevada, signing out.